"Don't hurt her, I'll buy her," shouted Grace, the seamstress, her voice trembling yet firm as she ran toward the sound of cries breaking from the forest. Through the tangled undergrowth, she saw her neighbor, Abbas, the man everyone called the cruel uncle, with a vine raised high. The girl in front of him was no more than 8 or 9, barefoot, thin, her arms held up in instinctive defense. The child's eyes were the color of storm-soaked earth, frightened, wild, hopeless. "Leave her be," Grace panted, clutching her skirt. "Take the coins instead. I'll buy the child." For a moment Abbas blinked in disbelief. Then he barked out a laugh that echoed too easily. "Buy her? What'll you pay? Buttons?" His teeth gleamed mockingly. "Fine then. The price of a goat." Grace didn't flinch. She dug into her apron and pulled out a small linen purse, the entire month's savings, her food, her rent, her thread money. Without counting, she tossed it at his feet. Silver clinked on the stones. A sneer twisted his face. He shoved the girl toward her so hard that she fell at Grace's feet. "She's yours then. A bargain. Good luck, seamstress." And with that the man turned and vanished between the trees. Grace bent down, lifting the trembling girl carefully to her feet. She didn't know her name, didn't know the story behind the bruises, didn't know how deep her fear reached. All she knew was that she couldn't leave her behind. So the seamstress and the orphan walked together through the dim forest path, one leading, the other following a few uncertain steps behind. The sun was sinking, staining the path with a light that seemed unsure whether to stay or flee. Back at home, the little clay house on the edge of the village, Grace lit the oil lamp. The small flame barely filled the single room, but it was enough. Enough for warmth, enough for safety. When dawn came, the new day woke shyly. The sky blushed pale pink. Roosters crowed from distant rooftops. Inside, the smell of porridge mingled with the slow, rhythmic hum of the old sewing machine. Grace was already working, the pedal tapping a steady heartbeat of routine. On a pallet in the corner, the girl slept curled under a patchwork blanket made of fabric scraps, pieces left from other people's joy and sorrow. She slept like someone who had forgotten what sleep meant. When she stirred, the first thing her ears caught was the metallic rhythm of the machine, the steady puncture of the needle through cloth. Startled, she sat up, glancing wildly around, her small body coiled like a trapped bird. Grace didn't stop sewing. She only looked over her shoulder, her tone soft as morning light. "Good morning, little one," she said, as though speaking to a bruised flower. "Are you hungry?" The girl hugged her knees, silent, eyes wide and wary. She shook her head. Grace didn't press. With quiet patience, she poured a bowl of porridge, its steam curling upward like gentle ghost hands. "Eat a little," she said, setting it down. "It's warm. I made it for both of us." The girl hesitated, then reached forward, dipped her fingers in, tasted, and began to eat. Silent tears slid down her cheeks, falling into the bowl and disappearing. Grace pretended not to notice. She knew there were tears that asked for quiet, not comfort. Outside, passers-by slowed when they saw a child near the seamstress's gate. It was an odd sight. Grace had never been seen with company, let alone a child. Whispers rose like smoke. "That's Abbas's girl," murmured one. "The daughter of disgrace." Another sniffed. "Poor Grace. She's letting trouble into her house." Grace kept her windows open but her heart steady. There were always more important things to mend than people's opinions. Days passed before the child spoke. It was a late afternoon, the breeze heavy with the scent of rain. Grace was bent over a wedding dress, her needle steady, while the girl washed bowls outside in a wooden basin. Then, faintly, like a secret escaping from a dream, came a voice. "My name is Zoo." The sound was so soft it could have been mistaken for wind. Grace paused, needle in midair. "Zuri," she repeated slowly, like tasting something sweet for the first time. "It means beautiful. Did you know that?" Zuri shook her head, uncertain if this was praise or memory. Grace approached, kneeling so they were eye to eye. Carefully, she brushed a strand of hair from the child's forehead. "From now on, no one will call you the daughter of disgrace. You are the daughter of hope." The girl didn't speak again, but her eyes changed. The fear softened, still there, but faintly threaded with something fragile. Trust. Trust took time. It moved slower than healing skin. Zuri flinched whenever someone's shadow passed too quickly. If there was shouting in the street, she hid under the table. When the fire cracked, she covered her ears. One night, a storm rolled over the rooftops. The wind rattled the shutters and rain drummed through the leaks in the clay roof. Thunder cracked like the earth splitting open. Zuri woke screaming, running barefoot to the room's dark corner. Grace got up without a word, fetched the wool blanket, and sat beside her. She wrapped the girl gently, humming a small tune that sounded like a prayer. The girl trembled for a while, but slowly her body eased. "The sky cries too sometimes," Grace whispered, brushing Zuri's tangled hair. "But when the crying stops, everything blooms again." That night the child fell asleep in her arms. Grace stared at the ceiling, realizing that love, like a needle, might pierce and ache, but only so it could join broken pieces together. And so the days began to weave themselves into something like a pattern. Zuri swept floors, fetched water, gathered scraps of thread. She'd stand on a stool beside Grace and watch every movement, learning how each stitch told a story. She didn't speak much, but her small eyes followed every flutter of Grace's hands as if memorizing them. Grace taught with patience measured in silence. Her years alone had made her gentle but strong, like cloth that had weathered too many washings yet refused to tear. Sometimes she would catch herself watching the child fold bright fabrics with tiny, careful hands and think, maybe God sent her to remind me that it's never too late to begin again. Each morning before sunrise, Grace sat once more at her sewing table. The pedal clattered softly, echoing across the clay walls. She would glance occasionally at the sleeping girl, the soft breathing, the small body bundled beneath the quilt. The sight reminded her of her own empty years after Mosey, her husband, had died. He had left her only the sewing machine, the house, and a heart she didn't know how to mend. People called her strong because she never cried. They didn't see that she cried with every stitch. Each needle puncture a silent confession of grief turned into usefulness. She'd sewn dresses for births, mourning veils for burials, school uniforms for children who grew too fast. Each fabric carried a story, each seam a prayer. Now, with Zuri in the corner, Grace felt something new rise between the clicking needles. Purpose. Perhaps the Lord had sent her not just to rescue a girl, but to be rescued herself from a life of quiet sorrow. On the third morning, curiosity came knocking. Asha, the neighbor known for her sharp tongue, stood at the doorway with folded arms. "I heard you brought Abbas's orphan home. Is it true?" Her tone made the truth sound like a sin. Grace answered without looking up from her stitching. "It's true." "No one else would," Asha scoffed, shaking her head. "You never learn, Grace. Always taking in problems that aren't yours. You'll die old, tired, and with nothing left to show." Grace raised her eyes calmly. "Better to be tired from kindness than empty from doing nothing," she said, and returned to sewing. Behind the curtain, Zuri froze. She had overheard everything. When Asha left, the little girl came out, clutching the hem of Grace's skirt. Her voice wavered. "Aunt Grace," she whispered, "why did you buy me?" Grace stopped pedaling. She looked up, thinking carefully before answering. "Because no one deserves to be treated like a thing." She smiled softly. "And because once, Zuri, I too needed someone to see me." That afternoon, the two sat on the porch. Grace showed her how to thread the needle. Zuri tried, pricked her finger, and gasped. Then she tried again, and succeeded. Her laugh rang bright and sudden. Grace's eyes stung with tears she hid behind a smile. It had been so long since laughter had stitched itself into that house. Weeks slid into months. Money was scarce. Rumors thickened like weeds. Some villagers stopped ordering dresses, afraid misfortune might be stitched into the hems. Grace worked anyway, patching and hemming by lamplight, praying that compassion could still pay the rent. At night she'd whisper before sleep, "If I was meant to find this child, Lord, give me the strength to keep her safe." Once, "By the community well," a woman remarked loudly, "that seamstress thinks she can fix the world with thread." Grace smiled, measuring her words like fabric. "A mended cloth may not look new," she replied, "but it still warms the one who wears it. The heart's like that too." Zuri, now speaking more freely, began helping with the real sewing. Her stitches were crooked at first, tangled, uneven. Grace only laughed softly, guiding her hands. "It doesn't have to be perfect, little one. Just honest." Every stitch brought them closer, not just as teacher and student, but as family threaded by shared scars. When night fell, they prayed side by side. Grace would ask for strength. Zuri, still learning what prayer felt like, would whisper just one word: "Thank you." And in the hush that followed, Grace knew that no cathedral could make gratitude sound purer. Before dawn, wind rattled the shutters again. Grace woke early, her thoughts drifting to Mosey's memory. "Wherever you are," she murmured, "watch over us. The roof leaks, but the house is full again." She glanced toward the corner where the child slept, clutching a soft roll of fabric like a doll. "Keep her safe, and keep me strong enough to be her shelter." Then she sat at the sewing machine and began to pedal. The sound filled the room, steady, comforting. Outside, the first gold of morning bloomed across the rooftops. Inside, the thread moved through cloth, binding, repairing, connecting, and in the corner, the girl named Zuri slept on, peaceful at last. It was the first time she had slept without fear. Grace looked at her and smiled, because sometimes courage isn't about shouting loudly or standing up to the world. It's simply about continuing to sew when everyone else believes. There's no fabric left to mend life. The afternoon wind blew hot over the yard when the sound of Abbas's heavy footsteps echoed once again on the dirt road. The chickens scattered and Grace's dog began barking. Restless, it had been 3 days since the man had last shown up in the village, and everyone knew that when he drank, he came looking for trouble. Grace, sewing in the shade of the mango tree, looked up and saw his figure approaching, his face flushed from the sun and the liquor. Zuri, who was carrying water in a clay pot, turned pale. Her whole body trembled and the pot slipped from her hands, shattering into pieces. The girl ran inside the house and curled up in a corner. Grace understood everything. She stood up slowly, wiped her hands on her apron and waited. "Seamstress!" Abby shouted before even reaching the gate. "I heard you've been going around saying you bought the girl. What kind of story is that?" Grace didn't answer right away. She simply watched him with the same calm gaze she used when the fabric stubbornly tore under the needle. Abbasi took another step, his breath heavy with alcohol. "I only left that useless girl with you because I was sick. Now I want her back." Grace crossed her arms firmly. "No, Abari. You sold her, remember? Said she was worth the price of a goat. You paid." The man laughed, a laugh that sounded more like anger than amusement. "And since when do people get bought?" "Grace," he sneered, "you think you own her now?" "I don't own anyone," the seamstress replied, her voice calm but steady. "I just wanted her to have peace." He stepped closer, raising his voice. "That girl is my family. No one tells her what to do but me." He tried to push the door. Grace, quick, held the frame. She was small in stature, but her presence filled the space. "Abi, you lost the right to speak of family the day you raised your hand against Akold." The tension in the air was like a thread about to snap. People started gathering, curious, but no one intervened. Then Grace did something few expected. She turned into the house, grabbed the handkerchief where she kept her savings, and took out the coins she had used the day she bought Zuri here. "Abby," she said, holding out the money, "take back what I gave you. I want no debt with the devil, but the girl stays." Abbasi looked at the coins, hesitated, and his wounded pride screamed louder than reason. "Keep the brat." Then he spat. "You'll regret it." And he staggered down the road, laughing loudly and cursing his fate. Grace calmly closed the door. When she turned around, Zuri was there, curled up behind the curtain, her face covered in tears. The seamstress knelt before her and took her hands. "He won't come back, you hear?" she said, looking firmly into the girl's eyes. "You're safe now." Zuri shook her head, not believing it. Fear still lived deep inside her. Grace saw that and wrapped her in a hug. "Sometimes evil walks out the door, but the heart takes time to understand the house is clean," she murmured. "In time, you'll see in the days that followed." The story spread throughout the village. Some praised Grace's act. Others criticized it. They said she was crazy for spending her few coins on a child with no name and no future. One woman even said at the market, Grace should have bought fabric, not trouble. But none of that shook her. At night, while mending clothes under the faint light of the oil lamp, she thought of her late husband's words. "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's what we do." Even while trembling, and Grace did tremble, but she kept going. One afternoon, Zuri asked, "Aunt Grace, why does Mr. Abbey hate me so much?" The seamstress set down her needle and answered gently, "Because some people have closed hearts, Zuri, and when the heart is closed, other people's kindness irritates it. He doesn't understand love because he never learned how to receive it." The girl stayed silent, staring at the floor. Grace added, "But we'll open that heart even if it takes prayer and patience." Zuri looked up and for the first time saw a different light in Grace's eyes. It wasn't just kindness, it was faith. Not the kind that comes from churches of fancy words, but the kind that is born from a tired soul still willing to love. That night, as the wind whistled through the cracks and the distant sound of drums echoed from the village, Grace looked up at the sky and whispered, "Lord, if I've sinned by loving too much, let that love at least serve to heal someone." And so, between fear and courage, between pain and faith, destiny began tracing the path that would forever bind the seamstress and the girl to different souls, stitched together by the same hope. The rain started light that night, but soon turned into a windstorm that seemed intent on tearing the roof of Grace's small house. The wind howled through the cracks, groaning as if the whole forest were mourning. Inside, the flame of the oil lamp flickered, casting shadows on the clay walls. It was the first storm since Zuri had arrived, and the frightened girl huddled close to the old seamstress. Grace noticed the fear in her eyes. She stood up, added more wood to the fire, and said in a calm voice, "Rain doesn't come to scare us, Zuri. It comes to wash the world." The girl stayed silent, watching the drops trickle from the roof. After a while, Grace grabbed a pot and began preparing some chicken soup. The smell of the chicken and dried herbs filled the air. Zuri watched in silence, curious. "Ever had soup made with love?" "Girl," Grace asked with a smile, "it's the best medicine there is. Heals even a tired heart." When the broth was ready, she served 2 steaming bowls. Zuri hesitated before picking up the spoon, as if unsure whether she was allowed to. Grace noticed and pushed the bowl a little closer. "In this house, no one needs permission to eat. Understand? If you're hungry, there's always a place at the table." The girl smiled shilly and began to eat. With each spoonful, she seemed calmer. The storm roared outside, but inside peace settled in little by little. Later, Grace prepared a basin with warm water and a piece of soap. "Let's wash the dust off the road, little one," she said gently, calling Zuri over. The girl obeyed, but trembled with embarrassment. It had been a long time since anyone had taken care of her. Grace washed her feet, her face, her hair, and it was there under that soft light that Zuri realized there was another kind of touch, the kind that heals, not the kind that hurts. "All done," Grace said, wrapping her in a towel. "Now you smell like a new life." Zurishai looked down. "Aren't you afraid I'll be too much trouble?" Grace laughed. "Trouble? I've got more than enough of that already, girl. What I was missing was company." That night, Grace prepared a little corner for Zuri to sleep. She laid clean blankets over a mat, placed a small oil lamp beside it, and said, "If thunder scares you, call me. Fear only grows in the dark, and in this house the light never goes out." The girl lay down, her body still tense, but slowly her eyes began to close. Grace sat nearby, watching her. The sound of the rain hitting the roof was like an old lullaby. She remembered her mother's words. When God wants to heal someone, he sends another heart to be a shelter, and in that moment, she understood what that meant. In the middle of the night, a louder thunderclap startled Zuri awake. She ran to Grace's bed, and without saying a word, Grace opened her arms. Zuri curled up there, her heart racing. Grace gently stroked her hair and whispered, "Sleep, my daughter. Evil can't enter where there is love." It was the first time Zuri had ever heard someone call her daughter. She cried softly, not from sadness but from relief. Grace felt her tears soaking into her own arm and silently promised, "As long as I have breath, no one will ever hurt you again." The days that followed were simple but full of meaning. Grace taught Zuri how to sweep the yard, fold fabrics, and recognize the songs of the birds. The girl didn't laugh much, but her smile began to surface. Sometimes when she thought Grace wasn't looking, she would sing to herself songs her mother had taught her before everything fell apart. One afternoon, as the sun was setting, Grace noticed something that made her smile. Zuri was sleeping on a colorful cloth, hands open, her face relaxed. She looked truly safe at last. That same night, the seamstress wrote a silent prayer in her heart. "Lord, thank you for the little I have. With it today I saved a life." And so in that humble house of clay and hope, 2 weary souls began stitching together a new story. Stitch by stitch with threads of love and patches of faith. The days began to pass slowly and steadily, like the gentle waters of the river after the flood. The sun rose over the rooftops of the village, and the sound of the sewing machine once again set the pace of routine in Grace's home. At first glance, everything seemed peaceful, but inside there were wounds that time still didn't dare to touch. Zuri woke up every morning before the rooster crowed, with the same alert, frightened eyes, even in safety. She lived as if waiting for the punishment that always came. Grace noticed it quickly. There was something in the girl's gestures. The way she shrank back at the sound of footsteps. The way she hid her hands when she made a mistake that spoke louder than any words. One day while combing her hair, Grace noticed thin scars on her back. Some old, some recent. She touched them gently, and the girl flinched. "Who did this, Zuri?" she asked softly. The girl didn't answer. She just bit her lip and let her gaze fall to the packed earth floor. Grace understood. There are pains that can't be told, only carried. "The body forgets more easily than the heart," murmured the seamstress, almost to herself. "But the heart needs time to heal." In the days that followed, Grace began worrying less about chores and more about the silences. Sometimes she let the machine sit idle just to hear Zuri softly humming a wordless melody. It was a sad tune, but alive. It seemed that through song, the girl was stitching her memories back together. One afternoon, while Grace was mending a customer's dress, Zuri ran in breathless. "Aunt Grace, I spilled the water jar," she said, terrified, already bracing for punishment. Grace looked at her, took a deep breath, and replied, "So the floor got wet, didn't it? Well, then the water will dry, and if the jar didn't break, it still works." And she went back to sewing. The girl stood there confused. She expected the yelling, the slap, the punishment, but none of it came. Slowly, a strange relief spread through her body. Grace looked up and smiled. In this house, no one gets hit for making a mistake. Mistakes are part of learning. Zuri didn't say anything, but that night she slept more peacefully. For the first time, she dreamed without fear. Healing, however, didn't come easily. There were days when the girl shut down, cried for no reason, or refused to eat. Grace respected her pace. Instead of questions, she offered presents. A plate of food left on the table. A clean cloth folded on the bed. A simple word spoken at just the right time. "The soul," Zuri the seamstress once said, "is like old fabric. If you pull too hard, it tears. You have to sew it gently, stitch by stitch." The girl started to believe in those words. She spent more time beside Grace, watching every movement, every stitch of thread, every calm breath. And the more time passed, the more fear hid behind hope. One late afternoon, as the sky turned orange, Zuri brought a small piece of cloth to Grace. On it, she had stitched a crooked flower made of uneven stitches. "I made it for you," she said, embarrassed. "It's ugly, I know." Grace held the fabric, moved. "It's beautiful, girl. You know why? Because it was made with your heart, and the heart never stitches anything ugly." Zuri smiled, and that smile was worth more than all the words Grace could ever hear. That night, after the girl had fallen asleep, the seamstress sat at the table, gazing at the embroidered flower. She thought of how many times she herself had needed healing and had no one to provide it. Now she understood God hadn't left her alone. He had only waited for the right moment to give her a new reason to love. Outside, the wind blew gently, and the sound of the leaves felt like a whisper of gratitude. Grace put out the lamp, looked to the sky, and said, "Thank you, Lord, for letting me take care of her, and for teaching me that healing someone else is the most beautiful way to heal ourselves." Meanwhile, Zuri slept deeply, hugging the cloth where she had stitched the flower. It was simple, imperfect, but full of meaning, just like everything born from love. And in that small house, silence was no longer made of fear, but of peace. A peace built slowly, stitched together by two souls who had learned, each in their own way, that even the deepest wounds can become something beautiful when they find shelter. Time moved slowly in the village of Ender. Mornings arrived full of light, roosters crowed, and the sound of Grace's sewing machine was already known as the start of the day. But behind the smiles and the smell of fresh bread in the streets, there was always the sharp tongue of the neighbors, ready to wound where the heart was still healing. The story of the girl bought for the price of a goat didn't take long to spread. First in quick whispers at the market, then in longer conversations by the well. "That seamstress is going mad," they said. "She brought a child with no father or mother into her home. Who knows what kind of curse she carries?" Others went further. "They say she makes the girl work like a servant and still acts like she's some saint." Grace heard it all. The sound of gossip drifted in like wind through the cracks, but she never defended herself. She simply bowed her head and kept sewing. She knew people's cruelty was like a bent needle, tried to straighten it, and it just breaks. Zuri, however, felt the weight of those words. When she went to the store to buy flour, she heard the muffled laughter. One day, she came back in tears, and Grace, seeing her, understood without needing to ask. Double quotes. "Child, don't listen to what comes from bitter mouths. People who don't know love invent poison for those who do." But the girl insisted. They said, "I'm a servant that you bought me to work." Grace placed her hand gently over Zuri's and replied, "I bought you to set you free, not to imprison you. Real love doesn't have chains." Still, the wound left by those words ran deep. For days, Zuri withdrew. She avoided going out, spoke very little, and only at night, when she thought Grace was asleep, did she cry quietly. One morning, as the sun painted the yard gold, Grace had an idea. She called the girl over, showed her a pile of colorful fabrics, and said, "Come here. I want to teach you something beautiful." Zuri came closer, curious. "Look," said Grace. "Each color holds a feeling. Red is courage, blue is peace, yellow is hope. When someone speaks badly about you, imagine yourself dressed in these colors. That way the evil won't touch you." Zuri smiled a little shyly, and spent the rest of the day helping to sew. The two embroidered flowers on the cloth, and as the threads intertwined, the girl began to hum. It was a soft melody, as if breathing life back into something the world had tried tossilence. But the gossip didn't stop. A group of women led by Asha, the neighborhood gossip, decided to confront Grace in front of everyone. It happened on a Sunday right after Mass. People were gathered near the square when Asha raised her voice. "Grace, they say you took that girl in to make her your servant. Is it true?" The murmur spread like wildfire through dry grass. Grace stood, wiped her hands on her apron, and answered calmly. "It's true, she helps me. Yes, just like I help her live, but no one serves anyone. Here we care for one another." Asha scoffed, crossing her arms. "Care what kind of woman buys a child?" Grace looked around, her eyes steady. "The kind who couldn't bear to see an innocent beaten. The kind who believed a life is worth more than a handful of coins." Silence fell heavy over the crowd. "And if that's madness," she added, "then may God let me be mad for the rest of my days." Some lowered their heads, others looked away. And it was Zuri who, for the first time, stepped forward, holding the cloth she had embroidered days earlier. She held it out and showed everyone a red flower stitched with simple threads. "Aunt Grace taught me," she said with a trembling voice. "She bought me, yes, but with love, and her love gave me my life back." The crowd fell silent. Even Asha, who always had something to say, was at a loss for words. Grace took the cloth from Zuri's hands and held it up. "Anyone who wants to speak ill of us. Look at this," she said, "because this is how you mend what the world has torn apart, with thread, patience, and faith." That day, the village saw that a woman's strength doesn't lie in what she owns, but in what she is willing to protect. Grace returned home with a light heart, and Zuri, for the first time, walked without lowering her head. That night, as the moon shone between the clouds, the seamstress said, "People talk, Zuri, but God watches, and he knows who acts out of pride and who acts out of love." The girl smiled. "So he saw what you did for me?" Grace replied, "He did, and he's the one who gave me the courage to do it." The moon lit up the small yard, and the cloth with the red flower swayed on the clothesline, a silent symbol of dignity. Grace's house might have been poor, but inside it lived something no amount of venomous tongues could destroy. A love that didn't defend itself, only endured. The month was drawing to a close when the peace of Grace and Zuri was broken by footsteps neither of them ever wanted to hear again. It was late afternoon, the sun dipping behind the hills, and the air smelled of warm earth after the rain. Zuri was sweeping the yard, humming softly when the dog's bark announced someone's arrival. She looked toward the gate and felt her blood run cold. There he was, Abby. The man came stumbling, his face marked by fatigue, and his eyes red from drink. His dirty clothes, unshaven face, and unsteady steps told the story of someone who had lost even the respect of himself. Grace, sewing on the porch, looked up and stopped the pedal. The silence between them was heavy, as if time itself paused to listen. "I came to take what's mine," said Abbasi, his voice rough as he cracked his fingers. "That girl belongs to me, and I want her back." Grace stood slowly, wiped her hands on her apron, and replied firmly, "No one belongs to anyone, Ababi. I've told you that before." He laughed, a horse-mocking laugh. "You speak pretty seamstress, but you forget I'm her uncle. Blood is blood." He took a step forward, his body swaying. "She's coming back with me today, whether you like it or not." Zuri stepped back, trembling. Grace moved. Between them, her gaze steady, her body upright. "You sold her Abby for a handful of coins. And more than that, you lost the right to be called family the day you raised your hand against a child." The man advanced, furious. "Who do you think you are to talk to me like that? A woman alone, no husband, no children." His voice came out like venom. "You live off sewing and think you can teach others about morals." Grace took a deep breath. "I'm a woman who's not afraid of the truth. And the truth is, you don't want the girl. You want control." She pointed to the gate. "Leave a bossy here. She has a home. She has love. She has peace. With you, she'd have nothing but pain." Her tone was not angry. It was resolute, and that only enraged the man further. He stepped closer, reaching out to shove her, but before he could touch her, voices rang out from the street. Neighbors began to gather, drawn by the shouting. Among them was Asha, now watching silently, ashamed of the cruelty she once helped spread. "What's going on here?" Ascadon of the men. Dot and Grace answered without fear. "He wants to take the girl by force." Abby looked around and realized there were now witnesses. He tried to keep his composure, but his voice trembled. "She's my niece. No one has the right to keep her from me." An older woman named Mieri stepped up to the gate. "We all saw the marks on her body. A bossy, you lost the right to call her yours. The moment you chose to treat her worse than an animal." The silence that followed was thick. The man stepped back but tried once more. "And who's going to decide this? You people?" Mama Jury lifted her chin. "No, the Council of Elders." And she sent someone to call the village chief. That evening, Grace's house filled with people. Men and women gathered outside the gate while the village chief, a man named Moa, listened to both sides. Grace told how she had found Zuri in the woods, her wounds, her fear, and the deal made for a handful of coins. The villagers listened in silence, each word seeming to stitch justice into the air. Abasi tried to defend himself, but his own words betrayed him. His voice stumbled between guilt and arrogance. In the end, Muima spoke. "The council will decide," he said. "But until then, the girl remains under the care of the seamstress. No drunk man, not even a relative, can claim what he abandoned." Abby tried to protest, but murmurs from the crowd began to rise, and the voices grew louder until the message was clear. "Leave the girl." Some stepped forward, and Abby, realizing he had lost, spat on the ground and staggered down the road, carrying nothing but his shattered pride. Grace took a deep breath and looked at Zuri. The girl was crying, not from fear, but from relief. She clung to the seamstress and whispered, "I thought he was going to take me." Grace stroked her hair. "Evil shouts, Zuri, but goodness doesn't stay silent." Today the people spoke. That night, after everyone had left, Grace sat at the door, looking up at the moon. The breeze was soft, and she felt in her chest the weight of someone who had fought against injustice and won. Without lifting a hand, inside, Zuri slept peacefully, for the first time without fear that someone might open the door to take her away. Grace looked to the sky and whispered, "Thank you, Lord." Today, evil was cast out not with hatred, but with courage, and as silence settled over the village, the seamstress's heart beat steady like the quiet certainty that true faith doesn't need to scream. It only needs to stand firm, like the thread that resists the needle and turns torn fabric into a new story. The next morning, after the confrontation, the village woke under a strange silence. The sun seemed shy, hidden behind the clouds, as if it too was waiting for the outcome of that story. Grace swept the yard in front of the house while Zuri, her eyes still swollen from the night before, helped gather the fallen leaves. Neither of them spoke. It was the kind of silence that comes before a man's judgment and sometimes God's. Around noon, a messenger from the village chief knocked at the door. "Moa has summoned you," he said seriously. Grace nodded, adjusted the scarf on her head, and took Zuri's hand. "Let's go, my daughter. The time has come to tell the truth." The walk to the elders' hall felt longer than ever. People watched from their windows, some in solidarity, others simply out of curiosity. When they arrived, the courtyard was already full. In the center, beneath the great mahogany tree, the council of elders sat in a circle. Muima, the chief, stood tall, his staff planted firmly in the ground. On the other side, Abasi, filthy, tired, and ashamed, waited with his head down. "Grace, speak," said the chief. The seamstress took a deep breath and began. Her voice was firm, not angry, but full of truth. She told how she had found the girl in the forest, being dragged by her uncle, and how, moved by compassion, she'd offered her coins to save her. She spoke of the wounds she had tended, the nights Zuri cried in her sleep, the fear she still felt when hearing a raised voice. Each word was an invisible thread stitching a story of injustice before everyone's eyes. When she finished, Moa turned to Ababi. "And you, what do you have to say?" The man tried to speak, but his words came out like stones tumbling. "It was too much responsibility," he muttered. "I just wanted to teach her discipline. A child needs to learn early." The chief interrupted him. "To teach is not to hurt, Ababi. No man has the right to use force to correct what he doesn't understand." One of the eldest elders, Baba Kato, raised his voice. "I saw the marks on the girl's back, and also saw the light in her eyes now. After living with the seamstress, there's no lie in that. What this woman did was an act of courage." The crowd, silent until then, began to murmur in agreement. Moa struck the ground with his staff. "It is decided," he said. "Abasa for neglect and cruelty. You will serve 6 months of community labor. You will serve this village and help the poor until you learn the value of compassion. As for the girl, she will remain permanently under Grace's care." The silence that followed was broken only by the wind rustling through the leaves. Zur clutched Grace's hand and cried, but this time the tears were of relief. The village began to applaud. It was a gentle, respectful applause, as if everyone understood that what had just happened was more than a verdict. It was justice. Abi, head down, tried to leave but was stopped by Babakato. "Before you go," said the elder, "ask the girl for forgiveness." The man hesitated, ashamed. The crowd waited. Then in a hoarse voice he said, "Forgive me, Zuri. I didn't know how to be your uncle." The girl said nothing. She simply looked at him, and in that look there was more wisdom than in any words. Grace, her heart tight, held Zuri's hand and answered for her. "Forgiveness isn't given by the one who commands, but by the one who loves. May God have mercy on you, Abosi." The man left carrying his shame with him. Grace and Zuri returned home accompanied by neighbors and friends. On the way, Asha approached and said quietly, I spoke badly of you, Grace. Today I saw how wrong I was. Grace replied simply, those who speak may learn. Those who act teach. Back home, the seamstress lit the oil lamp and looked around. The house felt lighter, as if its walls were finally breathing relief. Zuri, sitting on the floor, played with pieces of fabric, stitching small flowers. Grace watched her and smiled. Today came man's justice. My daughter, but God's has been coming for a while now. Outside the sky cleared and the sunset painted the horizon in gold and violet. It looked as if the sky itself was celebrating the girl's freedom. That night the village slept in peace, and for the first time since it all began. Grace slept soundly too, with no weight of fear or doubt. She knew that goodness doesn't force its way. It perseveres, and that justice, when it arrives, may take its time but always comes dressed in light. The years began to pass with the calm of well-lived days. The sun came and went like an old friend, and the sound of Grace's sewing machine now blended with Zuri's gentle laughter. The girl no longer walked, hunched in fear. Her steps were steady, and her once sorrowful eyes now reflected hope. What was once a shelter of rescue had become a home full of life. Zuri grew, and with her so did her talent. The small hands that once trembled in terror had become agile and delicate. She had learned to sew by watching Grace, and soon began creating her own designs. The two of them spent hours side by side, united by thread and meaningful silence. When one missed a stitch, the other smiled, and through laughter and thread, the wounds of the past began turning into flowers on the fabric of life. The house, once simple, was now filled with color. Bright fabrics hung from the walls, and hand-embroidered dresses dried in the wind like flags of hope. The women of the village began to appear one by one, asking to learn from the girl who they said had hands of light. Her stitches seem to breathe, said one woman. Every dress she makes brings good luck, said another. And so what began as an act of compassion became gift and purpose. One morning Grace watched as Zuri attended a client on her own. A young woman from the village had brought her wedding cloth, and Zuri, with a confident voice, asked, "Would you like the flowers to rise up to the chest or stay closer to the waist?" The client answered, and Zuri carefully made notes, just as she had seen the seamstress do countless times. Grace, sitting on the porch, watched in silence. Her eyes held pride but also gratitude. Later, while sewing together, Grace said, "When I found you, you were a wounded seed. Now look at you, Zuri, you've blossomed." The girl smiled shilly and replied, "I bloomed because someone believed I could." In the village, no one called her the bought girl anymore. Now she was known as Grace's daughter, or the girl who stitches blessings. The people began to see in her what they once ignored. Not the mark of pain, but the light of new beginnings. The dressers Zuri created were different. No two were alike because, as she said, every woman carried her own story, and each story deserved its own design. Some dresses spoke of love, others of loss, and some told tales of rebirth. Her stitches were her prayers. One afternoon during harvest season, Grace fell ill. Her tired body no longer responded as it once did. Zuri cared for her with patience, brewing teas, fluffing pillows, keeping the fire going, and every night before sleep, she whispered the same prayer. "Lord, let me care for her the way she cared for me." It was during that time that Zuri discovered something precious. The love that heals is the love that returns. Seeing her there, steady and strong, Grace felt her mission was fulfilled. "What I planted has bloomed," she said one night. "Not in the earth, but in you." As the months passed, Zuri opened a small workshop in the backyard. She called it the House of Hands of Light. Women came from afar, bringing fabrics, dreams, and stories. Grace sat on the porch, watching. Sometimes she would close her eyes and simply listen to the sound of laughter and conversation. It was the harvest of good she had once sown in pain. One day, Zuri brought her a blue dress embroidered with white flowers. "I made it for you," she said. "Each flower represents a day you taught me to be brave." Grace touched a fabric and felt tears well up. "Blue is the color of Thesky," she said, "and one day when I'm no longer here, I want to be remembered like that in the blue of your memory." The two embraced, and within that hug was an eternity. It was the meeting of a woman who had given love and a girl who'd learned how to multiply it. Zuri, who once arrived nameless, now gave a name to all she created: hope. And everyone who wore her work said they felt something different, as if every stitch carried a piece of the story shared between the two. The villagers said Grace's house had become a blessed place, where sorrow could not enter, and where every piece of fabric carried a lesson, that from pain can come beauty, and from abandonment love can grow. On the porch, under the setting sun, Grace looked toward the horizon and said, "Flowers don't bloom in a rush, my child. They bloom when the rain understands the time of the seed." And Zuri replied, "Then you, Aunt Grace, were my rain." And so through threads, laughter, and silent prayers, the girl who was once wounded learned the true meaning of the word bloom. Not to forget the pain, but to transform it into fragrance. The years passed like leaves carried by the wind. The girl who once trembled in fear had become a woman with steady steps and a serene gaze. Zuri was now known far beyond the borders of the village. Her stitching had gained fame, and people from distant towns came to order dresses for weddings, celebrations, and ceremonies. But what drew people most wasn't the beauty of the clothes. It was the feeling each piece carried. In front of Grace's one simple house. Now lovingly restored, a wooden sign swayed in the breeze. Grace and Zuri Sewing House. Ziri had carved it herself with careful letters and a heart drawn between the names. She said that heart was the invisible thread that bound them even when time tried to pull them apart. Grace, now with white hair and slow steps, sat every morning on the porch to watch her daughter of the heart at work. The old sewing machine, once belonging to her late husband, was now moved by Zur's strong and youthful hands. The sound of the pedal echoed through the house, mixed with the voices of women who came for their orders and stayed for conversation. It was more than a workshop. It was a refuge. Many women found comfort there. They arrived sad, bruised, discouraged, and left smiling, carrying not just dresses, but words of affection, advice, and hope. Zuri never turned anyone away. The fabric is just an excuse, she would say. What I really sew is the soul. One day, a young widow brought an old torn piece of cloth. She wanted to turn it into something new for her child's baptism. Zuri examined it carefully and said, "This fabric still has life. It just needs patience and love." When she finished the work, the dress looked completely different. But she explained, the secret isn't hiding the tear. It's turning it into part of the beauty. Grace overheard the conversation and smiled. The girl she had once saved was now saving others, not with thread, but with compassion, and that gave her peace. At the end of the afternoon, as the sun set and shadow stretched long, Zuri always closed the shop with a little ritual. She would extinguish the lamps, cover the machine, and give silent thanks. Then she would sit beside Grace, and the two would watch the sunset together. It was the most beautiful moment of the day. "Aunt Grace," Zuri said once, "do you remember when I didn't even know how to hold a needle?" "I do," the seamstress laughed. "And I remember when you were afraid of everything, even your own shadow." Zuri looked to the horizon. "Now I understand what you meant when you said love is a thread that meant Grace," nodded. "Love is the strongest stitch. When the thread is made of kindness, not even time can break it." As the months passed, Grace's health began to fade. The hands that once moved with precision now trembled, and her tired eyes saw the world through a soft veil of light. But her smile remained. One morning, Zuri found her sitting at the machine trying to sew a small white cloth. "What are you doing, Aunt Grace?" she asked, concerned. The old woman smiled. "Just a little embroidery. I want to leave you something." Days later, when the fever came and her strength began to slip away, Grace called Zuri and said, "If one day I leave before you, keep sewing, my child, but never sew with your hands alone. Do it the way I taught you, sew with your heart." Zuri wept, holding her hands. "You're all I have." "No," Grace replied with a fading voice. "I was just the needle. It was God who stitched you together." A few months later, on a clear morning, Grace passed peacefully, surrounded by the sound of the wind and the scent of freshly pressed fabric. In the workshop, Zuri placed on the table the white cloth Grace had embroidered. On it, stitched in golden thread, was a single word: love. The workshop remained open, and Zuri kept the name Grace and Zuri Sewing House just as it had been on the sign, but now with a new purpose. With every garment she made, she left a hidden golden stitch, a symbol of the woman who had given her everything when no one else would. Over time, Zuri became a respected figure. They called her the mother of seamstresses, and her name crossed borders. But to her, the greatest title was another daughter. Sometimes at night, when the wind blew and the moon lit the porch, Zuri swore she could still hear the sound of the old machine's pedal echoing from some invisible place. And she would smile, because she knew that somehow Grace was still there in every thread, in every embroidered flower, in every soul healed by the hands that had learned the gift of tenderness. And so destiny fulfilled its promise. The woman who once said, "Don't hurt her, I'll buy her," left behind the rarest legacy. The legacy of a love that turns wounds into strength and sews with threads of faith the invisible fabric of eternity. It was late afternoon and the sky covered with heavy clouds signaled rain. The wind slipped gently through the cracks of the sewing workshop, making the curtains dance like veils of memory. Zuri was finishing a blue dress embroidered with small white flowers when she heard soft knocks at the door. They were tired, dragging footsteps, the kind that carried the weight of time. When she opened it, she found a hunched man, thin with a worn face and sunken eyes. For a moment, she didn't recognize him. But then, when she heard the rough, trembling voice, the past returned with force. It was Abby, the cruel uncle, now old and broken by his own life. He stood in front of her, unable to raise his eyes. "Zuri," he said in a breath of a voice, "I've come to ask for forgiveness." The words came out broken. "What I did has no excuse, but the weight has followed me for years." Zuri said nothing. Time seemed to stop. The memories came rushing in. The forest, the whip, the fear, the desperate eyes of a child who had never known love. But along with the memories came Grace's voice, soft as if still echoing inside her. "Forgiveness is a fabric that can only be sewn with time." She took a deep breath, looked at him and replied calmly, "Forgiveness is a fabric. Yes, and mine is already sewn." Abazi lifted his eyes, surprised. The tears that had long forgotten their path finally fell. He dropped to his knees before her, his body shaking. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he murmured. Zuri reached out her hand, helping him to his feet. "Forgiveness isn't about deserving. It's about freedom. Today, I free myself and you too." Grace had left a small cloth hidden away for that day, as if she had foreseen the reunion. Zuri walked to the table, opened a wooden box, and took out the white cloth embroidered with golden thread. She handed it to Abari. On it, a single word, mercy. The man clutched the fabric to his chest and wept silently. Then he turned and walked away, stumbling down the road until he disappeared among the trees. Zuri stood at the doorway watching the horizon. The sky, which had threatened rain, was now clearing, letting through the first rays of sun. It was as if the whole world exhaled with her. That night the workshop stayed lit until late. Zuri sewed slowly without haste, but each stitch felt like a prayer. Around her, the walls held the scent of dried flowers, the distant hum of the old sewing machine and the living memory of Grace. Over time, the Grace and Zuri sewing house became more than a workshop. It became a haven. There, orphaned girls found shelter and food. Wounded women found comfort and widows found companionship. Zuri welcomed them all with the same gaze. Grace once gave her a gaze that said, "You can still begin again." People began calling her the mother of seamstresses. They came from afar not just to learn the art of sewing, but the gift of mending the soul. And in every story she told, Zuri spoke of Grace. She would say that Grace's kindness was like a seed planted in the earth. It took time to sprout, but it bloomed forever. One night during a village celebration, someone asked what had become of the woman who had saved her. Zuri looked up at the sky, where the full moon shone brightly, and replied, "Grace lives here." She placed her hand over her chest, and in every thread I saw, the people fell silent, moved. The moon seemed brighter in that moment, and the breeze carried the faint scent of flowers, as if Grace herself had passed by, blessing the moment when the celebration ended, and silence returned to the village. Zuri sat on the porch and gazed at the sky. The stars twinkled like stitches of light on a dark fabric. She smiled and whispered, "That girl you once bought with what little you had, she was the greatest gift God ever gave me." And so the story of the two remained in the village's memory, not just as a tale, but as a lasting reminder. The love planted with courage turns pain into kindness and injustice into blessing. In the village of Indama, they say that on full moon nights you can still hear the sound of an old sewing machine in the distance, steady and rhythmic. And those who hear it understand it is fate reminding us that goodness, even in silence, keeps working. And that the seamstress who once cried out, "Don't hurt her, I'll buy her," with that one act, stitched the most precious fabric that ever existed, the fabric of redemption. If this story touched your heart, let us know where you're watching from. Leave a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to the channel. That really helps us keep bringing you real and emotional stories like this one. Thank you for being part of our